The immediate question is that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question. The Chair recognises the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is the second time in 2 days that I've followed the member for Kennedy in debate, which is vaguely troubling. First I want to pay tribute to all the community groups, Get Up, the climate action groups like the Moreland Climate Group and my own electorate of Wills, the Climate Institute and so many others, who've been drawing the attention of this issue, climate change, global heating, to us politicians so forcefully and passionately. Global heating is the moral challenge of our time. I have no doubt about it. And you have to go back to the end of World War II to think of a more important international event than the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference to be held in December this year. And Australia cannot go to that conference with empty hands. We must go to that conference and tell other countries that drastic action is needed to cut carbon emissions in the coming decades. And we can't do that. We can't look at the leaders of other nations in the eye and demand that they cut their emissions unless we are cutting ours. And that is why this bill is so important. That is why this bill must be passed. At present, we are not cutting our carbon emissions. They are going up. I repeat, they are going up. Just yesterday, we learned that Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions in 2008 were 1.1% higher than in 2007. This has been happening every year now throughout this decade, a rise in excess of 1%. We are tracking for carbon levels 20% above the year 2000 levels by 2020, whereas it is both government policy and opposition policy to cut carbon levels by between 5% and 25% by 2020 compared with the year 2000. That represents a turnaround of between 25 and 45% compared with what we're tracking for now over an 11-year period. So to meet it, we have to turn around our emissions by 2 or 3 or 4% every year. Now, I believe this is achievable, but to do it, the change must be dramatic. We must first stop going up. During 2009 and 2010, we must stabilise our emissions. Now, how on earth is this going to happen without this legislation being passed? The opposition say, let's delay, let's wait until after Copenhagen. I put it to the House that they always have a reason for delay. They never say, let's act now. This has been going on for 20 years. Deputy Speaker, 20 years ago, scientists were telling us that action needed to be taken. In 1990, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases found that temperature increases beyond 1 degree Celsius, and I quote, may elicit rapid, unpredictable and non-linear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. 20 years ago, we were told, keep temperatures down to a 1 degree Celsius rise and sea level down to a 20 mm per decade rise. That was 20 years ago. Over 10 years ago, the Liberal and National parties started saying action was needed. In September 1998, a federal parliamentary inquiry into greenhouse gas emissions, chaired by a National Party MP, recommended a trial emissions trading scheme in Australia, saying a scheme should include as many carbon sinks, emission sources and greenhouse gases as possible, be national, be underpinned by national legislation and be integrated with an international trading regime. And in 1999, again 10 years ago, the Howard Government's Australian Greenhouse Office announced it was undertaking a feasibility study on the introduction of a national emissions trading scheme. Liberal government, National Party Parliamentary Committee, over 10 years ago. And still those opposites say now is not the right time. Deputy Speaker, it will never be the right time for them. They are totally, utterly insincere on the issue of global heating. They prevaricate. They come up with every excuse in the book. It's all spin, rhetoric, cant. Anything and everything except action. The second thing that caught my eye in the news yesterday was General Motors in America going into bankruptcy. For years, General Motors in America has been a dinosaur, building petrol-guzzling vehicles and opposing efforts to mandate vehicle fuel efficiency standards. And now they're bankrupt because they failed to see where petrol prices were going, they failed to see where consumers were going, they simply stuck their heads in the sand. And I urge Australian car manufacturers not to do this. People claim that tackling climate change will cost jobs. The truth is there are tens of thousands of jobs in cutting our carbon pollution and moving to the low-carbon economy. Our car manufacturers should think seriously about manufacturing cars that run only on electricity. China is, Israel is, Denmark is. This is something we should think about in Australia. Deputy Speaker, Shire Gassi is a former senior executive at the international software giant SAP. He has produced a business plan involving the construction of car battery recharging stations at parking spaces and billing motorists online for the electricity they use. Fully charged cars would be able to go around 160 kilometres, and for longer trips, motorists would pull into stations resembling car washes and exchange their spent batteries for new ones. Now, people may worry about electric cars producing carbon, and of course our present methods of electricity generation produce massive carbon emissions. But by moving to solar, wind, geothermal and other carbon-free methods of producing electricity, this would not be so. Drivers would be freed of petrol price fluctuations, Australia would get cleaner air, a sustainable future for our car industry, dramatically reduced carbon emissions, an improved trade balance and energy independence. It's a no-brainer, and it's just one example of how we should be planning to change to a low-carbon economy. There are many, many others in forestry and biosequestration, with people like Rob Gell leading the way, in energy efficiency, in solar power, wind power, geothermal power. There will be jobs and there will be prosperity in making this change. The jury came in years ago on climate change and it keeps on returning its verdict. Droughts and bushfires in Victoria, floods in Queensland and New South Wales. It has already claimed thousands of lives around the world and millions are now at risk. Deadly flooding in India, cyclones and storm surges in the Pacific Islands, typhoons in Korea, heat waves in the south of France, drought in Ethiopia and in African countries leading to mass starvation. Back in 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that global greenhouse emissions must peak by 2015 and thereafter rapidly decline. It said any delay, repeat, any delay will considerably increase the risk of species extinction, water scarcity, food shortages, extreme weather, major health risks and swelling numbers of climate refugees. That is the legacy those opposite would have us leave to our children and our grandchildren. And how ironic it is that our farmers are now leaving an arid land rendered useless by the policies pursued by the very people they are elected to represent and look after them. I urge the House to support this bill.